Frank Burgers had covered 3 fires, 1 collapsed overpass, and a corruption scandal that took down a city councilman, all in the same week, and he still couldn't remember the last time he'd said more than 10 words to his own daughter. "Dad, can you sign this?" Salari asked one morning, holding out a wrinkled permission slip for a school trip. Frank barely looked up from his laptop, scrawling his name against the counter without reading a word of it. "Sure, sweetheart." She didn't correct him. She never did. 7 years old, and already fluent in the language of not asking for more than you'll get. At school, the other kids had mothers who packed lunches with little notes tucked inside, fathers who showed up to the spelling bee with a phone raised, cheering too loud. Salari had a photograph of a man she was fairly certain was her father, buried somewhere in a box, and a live-in version of him who left before she woke and came home after she'd already eaten dinner alone. "Doesn't your dad ever come?" a classmate had asked once, not unkindly, just curious in the brutal way children are curious. "He's busy," Salari had said, and left it there because the alternative, "I don't think he sees me," was too heavy a thing to hand a 7-year-old with a lunch tray. The morning it happened, Frank was late for a deadline and moving through his routine on autopilot, coffee, tie, keys, when a dizziness hit him so hard the bathroom tile rushed up to meet his face. "Dada." Salari's voice, small and already afraid, came from the hallway. "Dada, are you okay?" She found him crumpled against the sink, eyes open but somewhere else entirely, and she didn't call for help first. She dropped to her knees and grabbed his shirt with both fists. "Please wake up. Please. I don't care about anything else. I don't care if you never look at me again. Just, please don't be gone too." Something in the man on the floor stirred at that. Not recognition. He didn't know this child, this bathroom, this life, but the raw, unfiltered plea in her voice reached him anyway, the way sound reaches you underwater, muffled but undeniable. His eyes focused. Hers widened. "Dada," she whispered, testing the word like it might break. The man who was no longer entirely Frank sat up slowly, taking in unfamiliar hands, an unfamiliar face reflected dimly in the chrome faucet, an unfamiliar child staring at him like he'd hung the moon simply by opening his eyes. "Where am I?" Richard Coldstone thought, panic climbing his throat. "Whose life is this?" He opened his mouth to say something honest. "I don't know you. I don't know this place. Something has gone terribly wrong." And then he made the mistake of really looking at her. Red-rimmed eyes. A grip on his shirt that wasn't letting go. A hope so fragile it looked like it might shatter if he said the wrong thing. "What's your name?" he asked instead, voice hoarse. "Salari," she said. "You know my name, Dada." I don't know anything." "Tell me anyway," he said. "Tell me everything. Your school. What you like. What he stumbled over the pronoun. "What your father usually does in the mornings." Salari blinked at him, confused by the strangeness of the request. But children forgive strange easily when it comes wrapped in attention they've been starved of. "You don't do mornings," she said slowly. "You leave before I wake up." Richard felt something in this stolen chest tighten. He didn't know this girl. He didn't know if he even wanted this life. But he understood, with sudden and uncomfortable clarity, exactly what kind of father this body had been, and exactly what kind of damage that had left behind. "Not today," he said. "Today I'll walk you to school." Salari stared at him for a long moment, like she was waiting for the joke, the catch, the inevitable actually, never mind. When it didn't come, her whole face cracked open into something so bright it was almost unbearable to witness. "Okay," she said, scrambling up. Okay, I have to get my backpack." She ran off before he could take it back, if he'd even wanted to. Richard sat alone on the bathroom floor a moment longer, staring at hands that weren't his, breathing air that smelled wrong, existing inside a life he hadn't asked for and didn't understand. "This isn't my body. This isn't my daughter. This isn't my world." Down the hall, he could hear Salari humming, actually humming, while she packed her bag, the sound of a child who'd just been handed something she'd stopped believing she'd ever get. Richard closed his eyes. "But maybe, until I find my way back, I can at least not break her the way this man clearly did." He got to his feet, borrowed and unsteady, and went to find his shoes. By the second week, the newsroom had started to talk. "Burgers actually left at 5 today," one of the junior reporters muttered to another, watching Frank shrug into his coat with unusual purpose. 5. On a Tuesday. During a deadline week. "Maybe he's dying," the other offered. He wasn't dying. He was, as far as Richard could tell, slowly drowning in a life that wasn't his. and clawing his way toward the only thing in it that made any sense. A small girl who lit up every time he walked through the door on time. His editor, a perpetually unimpressed woman named Ruth, cornered him by the coffee machine. "You've turned in 3 stories ahead of deadline this month," she said, arms crossed, studying him like a specimen. "You interviewed the transit commissioner and made your kids' assembly. What happened to you?" "I don't know," Richard admitted, and it was the truest thing he'd said all week. "Something woke me up." Ruth squinted at him a beat longer, then shrugged. "Whatever it is, keep doing it. You're finally worth the desk space." At home, the changes kept unfolding in small, disorienting increments. Richard didn't know how to cook, but he learned badly, burning the first 4 attempts at pancakes until Salari, delighted rather than disappointed, declared burnt pancakes our thing now. He didn't know how to talk to a child, so he simply stopped pretending he did and asked her questions instead, real ones, and found that she answered everything with the terrifying honesty only children possess. "You used to look at your phone when I talked," she told him over dinner one night, entirely without malice, just reporting a fact. "Now you look at me." Richard set his fork down. "I'm sorry. For before." Salari studied him for a long moment, assessing the way she'd learned to assess adults who made promises. "I don't care if you're not really him," she said finally, matter of fact as anything. "Whoever you are. As long as you keep looking at me like this, I don't need you to be anyone else." Richard didn't have an answer for that. He just reached across the table and, for the first time since waking up in this stranger's life, let himself feel something other than dread about staying in it. The photographer assigned to the paper's newest investigative series arrived on a Thursday, 6-foot-something of quiet, coiled intensity, introduced by Ruth with the enthusiasm of someone handing off a difficult dog. "William's Waffles. He'll be shooting the corruption series with you. Try not to scare him off. We're short-staffed." Waffles didn't look like a man who scared easily. He had the kind of stillness that made a room feel smaller, an alpha's presence that most people instinctively stepped around. He looked at Richard for a beat too long, camera bag slung over one shoulder, and said nothing at all, just gave a short nod and got to work. It was 3 field assignments later before he said anything personal. "You flinch," Waffles observed, watching Richard step back reflexively when he leaned in to check a shot on the camera screen. "Every time I get close." "I don't like people close," Richard said. "Funny." Waffles didn't move away. If anything, he seemed amused. "Your daughter mentioned you didn't used to like her close either. Now apparently you 2 bake pancakes and burn them on purpose." Richard's jaw tightened. "You've been talking to my daughter?" "She talks to everyone at pickup. I was early for a shoot. She adopted me for 20 minutes and told me your whole life story." A faint, unfair smile. "Sounds like you're in the middle of some kind of miracle burgers." "It's not a miracle," Richard said quietly, more to himself than to Waffles. "It's borrowed time." Waffles tilted his head, something sharpening behind his eyes. Not quite understanding, but curious enough not to let the comment go. "Borrowed from where?" Richard didn't answer. He didn't have one. Not yet. But that evening, walking to his car, he found Waffles already there, leaning against the driver's door with 2 coffees in hand like he'd known Richard would need one. "I'm not asking you to explain yourself," Waffles said, holding one out. "I'm asking if I can walk your kid's dog sometime. She mentioned you don't have one, but she wants one, and I figure that's a fight you'll lose eventually." Richard stared at him, at this cold, unreadable alpha standing in a parking lot holding coffee like a peace offering, and felt, for the first time in weeks, something crack open in his chest that had nothing to do with Salari at all. "We don't have a dog," Richard said slowly, taking the cup. "Not yet," Waffles said, and there was something in the way he said it, patient, certain, unhurried, that made Richard's borrowed heart beat a little too fast for comfort. "This isn't my life," Richard reminded himself, watching Waffles walk away without asking for anything more than that. "I shouldn't let anyone else in." But standing there in the cooling evening air, coffee warm in his hands, he already suspected it was too late. Waffles became a fixture the way weather becomes a fixture, gradual, then undeniable, then simply part of the forecast you stopped questioning. He showed up to school pickup twice that first month, just passing by, which stopped being believable the 3rd time and became something Salari looked forward to without embarrassment. He carried her backpack like it weighed nothing. He let her narrate entire imaginary worlds during the walk home, nodding seriously at plot points involving talking cats and kingdoms made of frosting. "You're good with her," Richard said one evening, watching Waffles crouch to retie Salari's shoelace without being asked. I had sisters, Waffles said, not looking up. Loud ones. You learned to keep up. Is that why you're so patient with her? Waffles straightened, meeting Richard's eyes with a directness that never quite stopped catching him off guard. No, that's just her. She makes it easy. A pause. You make it harder. I'm not trying to. I know. Something almost gentle crossed his face. That's the part one like. The dog happened, eventually, a scruffy, three-legged rescue Salari named Biscuit over Richard's mild objections. And with it came a rhythm none of them had planned, but none of them fought either. Movie nights that started as just checking the new release and became a standing Friday tradition. A weekend trip to the coast that Waffles orchestrated under the guise of work photography, and then conveniently forgot to bring a single camera for. Baking disasters. School plays where Waffles filmed every second on his phone because Richard's hands were too busy applauding. It was after one of those plays, Salari triumphant in a cardboard crown, thoroughly unbothered by having forgotten half her lines, that Waffles kissed him. They were standing outside the auditorium, Salari off showing Biscuit's photo to a cluster of impressed classmates, and Waffles simply reached out, tucked 2 fingers under Richard's chin, and closed the distance like it was the most natural conclusion in the world. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't a question either, more a statement, slow and certain, Waffles' mouth moving against his with the kind of patience that made Richard's pulse stumble before his mind caught up to protest. When Waffles finally pulled back, he didn't look smug. He looked like a man who'd been waiting a long time and had simply run out of reasons to keep waiting. I don't do this, Richard said, breathless, hating how unconvincing it sounded even to his own ears. I know, Waffles said again, that same infuriating patience. You've told me. Repeatedly. And yet, this isn't. Richard stopped himself before my life could leave his mouth for the 100th time. How did you explain to someone that you didn't trust the ground you were both standing on? That you might vanish from it without warning? Waffles studied him, reading something in the silence that Richard hadn't said out loud. Whatever you're not telling me, he said quietly, you don't have to. I'm not asking for your whole story, Frank. I'm asking if I can be part of whatever's left of it. Richard didn't answer with words. He answered by not stepping back the second time Waffles leaned in. Salari noticed things shifting. She noticed everything, always had, the way children do when they've spent years reading a house for warning signs. She didn't mind Waffles. She liked him. In fact, in the uncomplicated way children like adults who show up consistently and never once made her feel like an inconvenience. But something else had started happening to her, something she didn't have words for and didn't dare explain, because the one time she'd tried, it had gone badly. It started as a heaviness behind her eyes at night, then a pulling sensation like being tugged sideways out of her own body. Then, one night in early autumn, she woke up standing in the doorway of Richard's bedroom, and no one in the room seemed to notice she was there at all. Data, she'd said. Nothing. Richard sat at his desk, writing, close enough to touch. Data, I'm right here. He didn't turn. His pen kept moving. She called his name 3 more times, voice rising toward panic, before the room seemed to fold in on itself, and she woke up gasping in her own bed, tangled in blankets, heart hammering like she'd run a mile. She told him the next morning, halting, unsure how to make it sound like anything other than a bad dream. I was in your room. I called you. You didn't hear me. I don't think you could see me. Like I wasn't really there. Richard's stomach dropped in a way he couldn't fully explain to himself, let alone to her. It was probably just a dream, sweetheart. It didn't feel like a dream, Salari said, quieter now, some old fear surfacing in her eyes. The fear of not being believed, of being brushed aside the way she used to be before. It felt like when you used to not look at me. Except worse. Because I tried and you still couldn't. Richard pulled her into a hug before she could see how badly her words had landed, some cold understanding threading through him that he wasn't ready to name. She's not imagining it, he thought, holding her tighter than he meant to. Something is happening to her, and I don't understand any of it. Outside, autumn light slanted gold and ordinary through the kitchen window, indifferent to the quiet dread now settled permanently in his chest. Winter arrived, and with it, the sense that something in their borrowed little family was running on a clock none of them could see. Salari's episodes grew more frequent. She stopped mentioning most of them, having learned, the way children learn things they shouldn't have to, that grown-ups had limited patience for things they couldn't explain. But Richard noticed anyway. The mornings she seemed thinner around the edges, The way she sometimes stared at her own hands like she was checking they were still solid. "Are you sleeping okay?" he asked one night, smoothing her hair back before bed. "I keep having the same dream," she admitted. "I'm looking for you. And I find you, but you're always somewhere I can't get to. Like there's glass between us." "That's just a dream," Richard said, the lie tasting worse each time he told it. "You always say that." She turned onto her side, voice small. "But what if it's not?" He didn't have an answer. He hadn't had one in months. Not for her episodes, not for the flashes of another life he sometimes caught at the edge of sleep, fragments of a family that wasn't Salari's, a name that wasn't Frank's. He'd stopped trying to solve it, and started simply trying to be present for as long as presence was possible. Waffles proposed on a Tuesday, of all days. No fanfare, no restaurant, just their kitchen, biscuit underfoot, Salari's science project drying on the counter. "I've thought about doing this somewhere fancier," Waffles admitted, kneeling anyway, ring box slightly dented from having lived in his coat pocket for 2 weeks of failed nerve. "Somewhere with candles. But then I figured, this is where we actually live." Seemed dishonest to propose anywhere else. Richard stared at him, throat tight. "Waffles, you don't have to say yes tonight." Waffles' voice was steady, but his hands, Richard noticed, were not. "I just needed you to know I'm not going anywhere. Whatever you're carrying, whatever you still haven't told me, I'll carry it too if you let me." Salari, who had been very obviously not eavesdropping from the hallway, burst into the kitchen at that moment, unable to contain herself any longer. "Say yes. Dada, say yes, please. I already picked out what biscuits wearing to the wedding." Richard laughed despite himself, wet-eyed, torn between two lives he didn't fully belong to. He thought of the fading edges of his daughter, the dreams that felt too vivid to be dreams, the creeping certainty that none of this was meant to last. Maybe that's exactly why I should say yes, he thought. Because nothing is guaranteed. Not even staying. "Yes," he said, and Salari's shriek of joy nearly drowned out Waffles' relieved, disbelieving laugh as he stood to pull Richard into his arms. The engagement should have felt like the happy ending Salari clearly believed it was. Instead, it seemed to accelerate whatever had been quietly unraveling beneath the surface of their lives. Salari's episodes stopped being occasional. They became nightly, her calling out in her sleep, waking exhausted, growing paler by the week in a way no doctor could explain. Richard took her to 3 different pediatricians. All of them found nothing wrong. All of them looked faintly troubled anyway, the way people do when instinct disagrees with data. "She's not sick," one doctor finally admitted, baffled. "There's nothing physically wrong with her. I don't know what else to tell you." Richard sat with Salari in the car afterward, watching her stare out the window with an expression too old for her face. "I don't think it's my body that's wrong," she said quietly, not looking at him. "I think it's me. Like I'm not supposed to be here as long as I have been. Don't say that. I'm not scared, Dada." She turned to him then, and her small smile nearly broke him in half. "I just wanted you to know in case," she stopped herself. "Never mind. In case what?" She shook her head and looked back out the window, and Richard didn't push, because some part of him, the part still tangled in half-memories of another life, another name, already understood, with dread pooling cold in his stomach, exactly what she'd been about to say. "In case I don't get to see the wedding." He gripped the steering wheel and said nothing, driving them home through streets that suddenly felt too fragile to trust, toward a wedding date circled in red on their kitchen calendar like a countdown neither of them had agreed to start. The night before the wedding, the apartment was too quiet. Waffles had gone home to give Richard space to panic properly. As he'd put it, kissing him goodnight with a laugh that hadn't quite reached his eyes, some instinct in him sensing the tension in Richard's shoulders without knowing its shape. Salari had gone to bed early, tired in a way that made Richard's chest ache to look at. He was hanging the wedding suit on the back of his door, smoothing a wrinkle that wasn't there when he felt the air in the room change. "Salari." She was sitting on the end of his bed, still in her pajamas, staring at the dress form Waffles had set up as a joke, a half-finished flower crown draped over it that she'd been weaving for weeks, insisting on making it herself. She looked thinner than he'd ever seen her. Not sick thin, fading thin, like a photograph left too long in sunlight, colors bleeding gently toward white. "Salari." He crossed the room, dropped to his knees in front of her. "What's wrong? Why are you up?" "I wanted to see the dress before." She stopped, smiled instead, small and a little sad. "It's pretty." "Salari, look at me." He reached for her hand, and his fingers closed around something that felt less solid than it should have. Still there, but barely, like holding mist that remembered the shape of a hand. His pulse spiked. "What's happening to you?" "I think I'm not supposed to be here anymore," she said, so calm it terrified him more than tears would have. "I think I was only ever borrowed too. Like you." "What do you mean like me?" "I don't know how I know that." She looked down at their joined hands, at how her fingers had gone translucent at the edges. "I just do. I think some things aren't meant to last as long as we want them to." "But," her voice wavered for the first time, "I got a dada who looked at me, who baked pancakes with me and let me pick the dog's name, and cried at my school play even though I forgot my lines. Whoever you really are, wherever you came from, thank you for giving me that. Even if it was only for a little while. Don't talk like this is ending." His voice cracked. "Don't you dare talk like this is ending, Salari." "I'm not scared," she said again, and reached up to touch his face, her palm barely more than warmth against his skin now. "I got to be happy. That's more than I ever thought I'd get." "Salari." She was still smiling when she came apart. Not violently, not painfully, just a slow unraveling like mist meeting morning light, the faint scent of strawberry shampoo lingering a heartbeat after the rest of her had already gone. Richard's hand closed around nothing. He didn't remember screaming. He remembered the door bursting open sometime later, Waffles' arms hauling him up off the floor where he'd apparently collapsed, Waffles' voice low and frantic asking what happened. "Where's Salari, Frank? Where is she?" "She's gone," Richard choked out, the words barely making sense even to himself. "She's just gone. There's no body, there's nothing. She was fading for months, and I didn't stop it. I didn't understand it, I should have." Waffles didn't ask him to make sense. He simply held on, steady in a way Richard didn't deserve and couldn't refuse, letting Richard shake apart against him the same way Salari had shaken apart against the dark. The wedding didn't happen the next day. It didn't happen for months. Richard barely left the apartment in the weeks that followed. Biscuit curled permanently against his side. The flower-crowned Salari never finished, sitting untouched on the dresser because he couldn't bring himself to move it. Waffles came every day anyway. Brought food Richard didn't eat. Sat in silence Richard didn't fill. Never once asked him to explain the unexplainable. Never once suggested Richard was imagining things, even though nothing about a child simply dissolving made sense to anyone. "I'm not leaving," Waffles told him, the 40th or 50th night in a row, when Richard finally asked why he kept coming back to a man who couldn't give him a straight answer about anything. "I told you a long time ago. Whatever you're carrying, I carry it too. That hasn't changed just because it got heavier." It was Waffles, eventually, who coaxed him back into the world, gently, without pressure, rebuilding the wreckage one ordinary day at a time. And it was Richard, months later, who finally said the wedding should happen after all, quiet and certain in a way he hadn't been able to manage before. "I don't know how much time I have left in this life," he told Waffles the night before, unable to fully explain what he meant, only that the words felt urgently true. "But I don't want to waste whatever's left of it not choosing you." They married in the same kitchen where Waffles had proposed, small and unremarkable and exactly right. On their wedding night, wrapped in Waffles' arms for what felt like the first truly peaceful sleep in a year, Richard Coldstone finally let go of the life he'd never asked to borrow, and the bed beside Waffles was empty by morning. Waffles searched for 3 months before he admitted, even to himself, that searching wasn't going to bring Frank back. He checked hospitals first, certain there had to be a medical explanation, some collapse, some amnesia, something that made sense inside the rules of the world he understood. When that turned up nothing, he checked morgues, throat tight the entire time, terrified of finding an answer and more terrified of finding none. He hired a private investigator who worked the case for 6 weeks and returned every lead as a dead end. No trace of Frank Burgers anywhere past the morning of their wedding. "There's no record of him leaving the building," the investigator said, baffled, sliding a thin folder across the table. "No card charges, no transit logs, nothing. It's like he stopped existing at exactly midnight." Waffles didn't tell him that was, impossibly, exactly what it felt like. He kept the apartment exactly as it had been, Biscuit's water bowl in the same corner, the unfinished flower crown still sitting untouched on the dresser, because moving it felt like admitting Salari was truly gone, and moving Frank's things felt like admitting the same about him. He read the letter Frank had left tucked in his jacket pocket, so many times the creases wore soft, the ink smudging faintly at the edges from his thumb. "I don't think I was ever supposed to stay this long. I'm sorry it has to end where it started, with someone I love disappearing. Please don't let this be the reason you stop believing love is worth the risk. It was worth it. You were worth it. Waffles stopped taking assignments that required travel. Stopped, eventually, taking much of anything beyond the bare minimum required to keep functioning. Colleagues worried. Family worried. He absorbed all of it with the same still, unreadable calm he'd always had, except now it wasn't strength holding it in place. It was simply the absence of anything left to perform. It was Ruth, of all people, gruff and unsentimental, who finally said the thing no one else would. You're allowed to grieve without giving up on everything else, she told him, cornering him by the same coffee machine where she'd once cornered Frank. He'd hate what you're doing to yourself. From what I saw of that man in his last year here, he fought like hell to become someone worth missing. Don't waste that by disappearing too. Waffles didn't answer her. But that night, for the first time in months, he took Biscuit for a walk instead of leaving him with the neighbor, and stood a long time outside Salari's old school, watching kids run across the same yard she used to point out from the car window. If you exist in this world, he said quietly, to no one, to everyone, to whatever thread of fate had unraveled his life so thoroughly, I will come find you, whatever it takes, however long. It wasn't closure. It wasn't even hope, not really, not yet. But it was the first vow he'd made since the wedding that he intended to keep. Richard Coldstone woke to sunlight and the sound of his own name, and the first thing he registered was that he was crying. You're awake. Oh my God, you're actually awake. Eva Coldstone's face swam into focus above him, relief cracking her voice. On his other side, Malta gripped his hand so hard it hurt. What happened? Richard rasped, throat raw like he'd been screaming, though he had no memory of making a sound. You collapsed, Malta said. Days ago. We couldn't wake you. The doctors didn't know why. Your vitals were fine. You just wouldn't wake up. Days. Richard tried to reconcile that against the sprawling weight of memory pressing behind his eyes. A newsroom, a daughter who fought her way into loving him, a man who brought coffee to a parking lot like an offering, a wedding, a child dissolving into starlight and strawberry-scented air. It had felt like years. It had felt like a whole separate life, lived and lost in full. Was it a dream? He asked, mostly to himself, still crying without entirely understanding why. You tell us, Eva said gently. You've been out cold for 4 days, and you woke up sobbing. That's not exactly dream behavior. Richard pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, willing the ache in his chest to make sense. He could still feel the ghost weight of a small hand in his. Still smell, faintly, impossibly, strawberry shampoo. Was it real? Was I really him? Was there really a life, a family, a man who loved me enough to marry me twice over? He didn't have an answer. He only had the certainty, bone deep and inexplicable, that whatever he'd lived through had mattered, and that some part of it wasn't finished yet. There's a dinner tonight, Malta said carefully, watching him with the wary tenderness reserved for someone freshly returned from somewhere unknown. Dad's business partner is coming, Mr. Peking, bringing his son. You don't have to come if you're not up for it. No, Richard said, wiping his face, some instinct he couldn't name already pulling taut in his chest like a wire remembering its tension. No, I'll come. He didn't know why the name Peking made something in him go suddenly, achingly still. He only knew, with the same certainty that had told him Salari's fading was real, that tonight mattered, that something interrupted a long time ago, in a life he could no longer fully claim as his own, was about to circle back around to finish itself. Mr. Coldstone's dining room was set with more formality than usual. The good china, the good wine, the kind of quiet tension that always accompanied his father's business dinners. Richard sat through the appetizers only half present, still raw from days of unconsciousness and a life he couldn't stop replaying behind his eyes. Ah, here they are, Mr. Coldstone said, rising as the doors opened. Mr. Peking entered first, an imposing alpha in his 50s, the kind of presence that filled a room before he'd said a word. Exactly the sort of old friend Richard's father would have kept for decades. Behind him came his son. Richard's spoon slipped from his fingers and clattered against the bowl. The young man who walked in was tall, sharp-jawed, carrying himself with the contained coldness of someone who'd spent his whole life being underestimated for it. His eyes swept the room out of habit more than interest, until they landed on Richard, and something in his expression flickered, just briefly, like static catching on a signal it wasn't supposed to receive. Grain, Richard said, before he'd consciously decided to speak at all. The room went faintly still. Mr. Coldstone glanced between them, bemused. You two know each other? I don't think we've met, Grain said slowly, gaze still fixed on Richard, brow furrowed like he was trying to solve a puzzle with half its pieces missing. Have we? In another life. In another skin. You stood in the rain outside a school recital for a daughter that wasn't even mine. Richard swallowed the words down, aware of 6 curious eyes on him. I must have mixed you up with someone, Richard said, recovering weakly. Sorry. Grain didn't look convinced. He took his seat across the table, and for the rest of the meal, Richard could feel his gaze return again and again, searching, unsatisfied, the way you search a familiar song for lyrics you can't quite place. It was Malta and Eva's fault, in the end, that Richard and Grain ended up alone on the terrace after dinner. The twins engineering an excuse about needing Grain's opinion on wine pairings that fell apart within 30 seconds of them abandoning the 2 men there. They're not subtle, Grain observed dryly, watching the terrace doors swing shut behind his hasty exit. No, Richard agreed. They're really not. Silence settled between them, comfortable in a way 2 strangers' silences shouldn't have been. Grain leaned against the railing, studying the city lights instead of Richard, which somehow made it easier for Richard to study him. You said my name before anyone introduced me, Grain said finally, not accusatory, just curious, careful. How did you know it? I don't know, Richard admitted. It was once again the truest thing he could offer. It just came out, like I already knew it. Grain turned to face him fully then, expression unreadable, searching. I felt something similar. When I walked in. Like I recognized you. I've been trying to place it all through dinner, and I can't. A pause. That doesn't happen to me. I don't forget faces. Maybe you didn't forget, Richard said quietly, surprising himself with his own honesty. Maybe you just haven't remembered yet. Something shifted in Grain's expression. Not confusion this time, but a kind of wary intensity, like a man recognizing the edge of something significant without being able to name its shape. That's a strange thing to say to someone you just met. I've had a strange few days, Richard said, and laughed, tired and a little wet-eyed, the exhaustion of everything he'd lived and lost finally catching up to him in full. Grain didn't press. He simply moved to stand beside him at the railing, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and said, with the plain directness Richard would come to recognize as entirely characteristic of him. Whatever it is, I'd like to figure it out. If you're willing. Richard looked at him, this cold, composed stranger who felt, impossibly, like something recovered rather than something new, and felt the first genuine steadiness settle into his chest since he'd woken up crying 4 days ago. Yeah, he said. I think I'd like that too. Neither of them mentioned it again that night. But neither of them, in the weeks that followed, quite managed to let the other go either, a slow, deliberate orbit of phone calls that ran too long, chance meetings that stopped being chance, and a recognition neither could explain, but both refused to dismiss. Whatever had been interrupted once, in a life half-remembered and half-lost, had found its way back into the room. And this time, Richard promised himself, watching Grain's headlights disappear down the driveway hours later, he wasn't going to let it slip away without a fight. They didn't fall into it easily. Grain was suspicious of the pull he felt, and used to wanting anything he couldn't fully explain, and Richard spent the first several months half-braced for the ground to disappear from under him again, the way it had once before. You do this thing, Grain said one evening, months into whatever they'd quietly become, where you look at me like you're waiting for me to vanish. Richard didn't deny it. I've lost people I loved without warning before. I don't think I've learned how to stop expecting it. Grain considered that, characteristically unhurried, and reached across the table to still Richard's restless hands with his own. I'm not going anywhere, he said, plain and certain in the way he said everything. I don't know what happened to you before I met you. I don't need to know all of it tonight. I just need you to believe I'm not part of whatever pattern you're bracing for. It took time, the better part of a year, arguments about things that mattered and things that didn't, the slow unlearning of instincts built by grief. But eventually Richard did believe him. Grain proposed on a rooftop instead of a kitchen, deliberately different from whatever half-formed memory Richard still occasionally flinched at, and Richard said yes before he'd even finished the question. Years folded into each other the way years do. A wedding smaller and quieter than either family expected. A house they picked out together after arguing for a month over the color of the front door. Careers that grew steadier as the two of them grew steadier alongside each other. Grain, for all his cold reputation in business circles, turned out to be embarrassingly soft at home. The kind of husband who remembered anniversaries without reminders and picked fights over who got to cook dinner. Richard, for his part, stopped flinching at closeness somewhere along the way without quite noticing when. The pregnancy, when it came, was unplanned and entirely welcome. Richard laughing through tears in a bathroom that felt, for one disorienting moment, achingly familiar, though he couldn't place why until Grain found him there and the memory slid loose all at once. Another bathroom, another collapse, another beginning he'd once feared instead of wanted. "Are you okay?" Grain asked, crouching in front of him, worry etched across features that had long since stopped being cold to Richard, only ever warm. "I'm okay," Richard said, and meant it fully for the first time in longer than he could measure. I think I understand something now that I didn't before." He didn't explain further. Some things, he'd learned, didn't need to be understood to be believed. The labor was long, loud, and entirely undignified, Grain gripping Richard's hand through every contraction with the same steady patience he brought to everything, murmuring reassurances that grew increasingly nonsensical as the hours wore on. "You're doing so well," Grain said for the 100th time, sweat damp and exhausted himself despite doing none of the actual work. "I love you. I love you so much. You're doing so well." "Stop talking," Richard gritted out, and Grain wisely obeyed. When the cry finally came, sharp, furious, entirely alive, the exhaustion in the room broke apart into something closer to disbelief. The nurse placed the baby against Richard's chest, and for a moment neither he nor Grain could manage words at all, just stunned, overwhelmed silence. Then, at exactly the same instant, without any prior discussion, without either of them having spoken the name aloud even once during the entire pregnancy, they both said it together. "Salari." Grain blinked, startled by his own voice. Where did that come from? Richard laughed, wet-eyed, cradling the small weight against him like something recovered rather than something new. "I don't know," he said, though he did, some fragile, wondrous certainty settling into place at last. "It just felt right, like we were finishing something." Grain didn't ask what he meant. He simply pressed a kiss to Richard's temple, then to the baby's forehead, and said, quiet and full, "Then let's finish it properly. Together this time." Outside the hospital window, morning light spilled gold and ordinary across the room. Indifferent to fate, indifferent to borrowed lives and unfinished ones, caring only for the small, insistent cry of a girl finally born into a story that meant to keep her.